In the United States, the idea of the military patrolling American streets is deeply unsettling. It goes against a core principle of separating military and civilian life. Yet, there is a law, forged in the nation's earliest days, that gives the president the extraordinary power to do just that. It's called the Insurrection Act, and its story is the story of America's greatest crises, from tax rebellions in the 1790s, to the fight for civil rights in Little Rock, to the fiery riots of Los Angeles. Welcome to G Fun Facts Online. Today we're exploring the history and controversy of the Insurrection Act, a law that grants a president the power to unleash the nation's military on its own soil. To understand this law, we have to go back to the very beginning. The founders were terrified of a powerful central government with a standing army. They had just fought a war against a king who used soldiers to enforce his will. But the first government they created, under the Articles of Confederation, was too weak. The breaking point came in 1786 with Shays' Rebellion. When debt-ridden farmers in Massachusetts rose up, the national government was powerless to stop them. A private army had to be hired. This failure haunted the framers of the Constitution, so they gave the new federal government the power to suppress insurrections. The first version of this power was the Calling Forth Act of 1792. It allowed the president to call up state militias to enforce federal law, but only after a judge certified that the situation was out of control. It was a power with the brakes on. Those brakes came off just 2 years later. In 1794, farmers on the western frontier, especially in Pennsylvania, were furious about a new federal tax on whiskey. For them, whiskey wasn't just a drink. It was a currency and a way to transport their grain to market. They saw the tax as an attack by a distant government. Resistance turned violent. Tax collectors were tarred and feathered. President George Washington saw this as a direct challenge to the new nation's survival. After a Supreme Court justice certified a state of rebellion, Washington didn't just send a message. He called up a militia of nearly 13,000 men and personally rode at their head as they marched into Pennsylvania. The rebellion evaporated. The message was clear. The federal government would enforce its laws, by force if necessary. A few years later, Freeze Rebellion saw President John Adams use similar force against tax protesters. But these early events highlighted a problem. Relying on state militias was slow and sometimes unreliable. The real game changer came in 1807, thanks to one of the most bizarre episodes in American history, the Burr Conspiracy. Former Vice President Aaron Burr was accused of plotting to create his own empire in the West. Faced with this potential internal fracturing, President Thomas Jefferson signed the Insurrection Act of 1807. This was a massive upgrade. It gave the president the power to use not just the militias, but the regular U.S. Army and Navy to suppress an insurrection. The president now had a professional, reliable federal force at his direct command. Throughout the 19th century, this power was used in ways that are deeply troubling today. Federal troops were sent to help suppress Nat Turner's slave rebellion in 1831. After the Civil War, the nature of domestic conflict shifted. The rise of industrial America brought violent clashes between labor and capital. During the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, President Rutherford B. Hayes sent federal troops to break the strike, arguing it was necessary to protect the U.S. mail. A similar story played out in the Pullman Strike of 1894, when President Grover Cleveland deployed the Army to Chicago against striking railway workers. In these cases, the Insurrection Act was effectively used as a tool to side with corporations against their own workers. But there was a remarkable and powerful twist in the story. In the aftermath of the Civil War, the federal government was trying to enforce the rights of newly freed African Americans during a period known as Reconstruction. This effort was met with a campaign of terror by the Ku Klux Klan. In response, Congress passed the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. This act explicitly amended the Insurrection Act, giving the president the power to use the military to combat the KKK. President Ulysses S. Grant used this new authority decisively. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus in parts of South Carolina, a hotbed of Klan violence, and sent in federal troops. Hundreds of Klansmen were arrested and prosecuted. Grant's actions effectively crushed the first iteration of the KKK, marking a stunning moment where federal military power was used to protect the civil rights of its most vulnerable citizens. This idea of using the act for justice reached its peak during the civil rights movement. The most iconic moment came in 1957. 9 black students, the Little Rock Nine, tried to integrate Central High School in Arkansas. But the state's governor, Orval Faubus, called out the Arkansas National Guard to physically block them from entering, defying a Supreme Court order. This was a constitutional crisis. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had been hesitant to use federal force, had no choice. He invoked the Insurrection Act, federalized the entire Arkansas National Guard, taking it away from the governor, and dispatched the 101st Airborne Division to Little Rock. The image of elite paratroopers escorting black children to school sent a powerful message across the world. The federal government would enforce constitutional rights against state defiance. This wasn't a one-off. President Kennedy used the act in 1962 to send thousands of troops to Mississippi to ensure James Meredith could enroll at Ole Miss amidst a violent riot. And in 1965, President Johnson invoked it to send federal troops to protect the historic Civil Rights March from Selma to Montgomery. The Insurrection Act had been transformed into a shield for justice. But the story doesn't end there. The late 1960s saw a different kind of crisis. Massive urban riots fueled by racial tension and poverty. When a 1967 riot in Detroit spiraled out of control, overwhelming local police, President Johnson invoked the act and sent in the 82nd and 101st Airborne. He did so again in 1968 after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. sparked riots in Washington, D.C., Chicago, and Baltimore. The most recent formal invocation was in 1992. After 4 LAPD officers were acquitted in the beating of Rodney King, Los Angeles erupted in days of violence, looting, and arson. With the city in chaos, Governor Pete Wilson requested help. President George H.W. Bush invoked the Insurrection Act, deploying federal troops and federalized National Guard to restore order. In these cases, the act returned to its more original purpose, serving as the ultimate backstop when law and order completely breaks down. Now, you might be thinking, isn't it illegal to use the military for law enforcement inside the U.S.? And generally, you'd be right. That's because of a law called the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878. Passed after the end of Reconstruction, it was designed to prevent the kind of military occupation of the South that had just occurred. It creates a firewall between the military and domestic policing. But, and this is the critical point, Posse Comitatus has a built-in exception for laws expressly authorized by the Constitution or Act of Congress. The Insurrection Act is the biggest and most important of those exceptions. When a president invokes it, the prohibitions of Posse Comitatus are temporarily lifted, allowing the military to perform law enforcement duties. So where does that leave us today? The Insurrection Act remains one of the most potent and controversial powers a president has. It's a double-edged sword. On one hand, it's a vital tool of last resort for a president facing a catastrophic breakdown of order or a state openly defying federal law. The events in Little Rock show its potential for good. On the other hand, its language is dangerously vague. What exactly is an insurrection or domestic violence? The law gives the president almost sole discretion to decide, with very little oversight from Congress or the courts. This has led to serious concerns. In 2020, during widespread protests, President Trump threatened to invoke the act to send troops into American cities, sparking a fierce backlash. Critics argue the law is a relic, ripe for abuse by a president who might want to suppress dissent or intimidate political opponents. There are ongoing calls to reform it, to add clearer definitions, require congressional approval, or impose time limits. The debate over the Insurrection Act is really a debate about America itself. It forces us to confront the deep tensions between liberty and order, between the rights of states and the power of the federal government. It is a law forged in crisis that has shaped history and whose future will say a lot about the future of American democracy.